story start now. The house that time forgot. There are places in this world that exist outside of time. Places where the past has not faded into memory but remains frozen in place, waiting for someone to stumble upon it and bear witness to lives that were lived and then mysteriously abandoned. I found such a place a few years ago, deep in the woods of northern New Hampshire. And what I discovered there has haunted me ever since. It was not a ghost that frightened me, not some supernatural presence or unexplained phenomenon. What frightened me was something far more unsettling than any ghost could ever be. It was the evidence of ordinary human lives that had simply stopped, as if someone had pressed a pause button on an entire family's existence and then walked away, leaving everything exactly as it was on what must have been a perfectly normal day back in 1959. I need to tell you this story because it has been sitting heavy in my mind for years now, and maybe if I write it all down, if I share every detail of what I saw and felt that day, I can finally make some sense of it. Or maybe I will never make sense of it. But at least I will have told someone about the mystery I stumbled upon. About the questions that keep me awake at night. About the family that vanished without a trace from their home in the woods. Before I begin the story of what I found, I should tell you a little bit about myself and why I was in those woods in the first place. I have always been fascinated by abandoned places. There is something compelling about buildings that humans once filled with life and activity, but have now left behind to slowly return to nature. Other people collect stamps or coins or antiques. I collect experiences of abandoned places. I photograph them. I document them. I try to imagine the stories of the people who once lived or worked in these forgotten spaces. I know that some people think this hobby is morbid or disrespectful or even illegal, depending on how you access these places. And yes, I will admit that what I did on the day I am about to describe probably crossed some legal lines. But I have always operated from a place of respect for these abandoned spaces. I do not vandalize or steal or destroy. I simply observe and document, trying to preserve in photographs and memory what will eventually be lost to time and decay. On the particular day this story takes place, I was hiking in northern New Hampshire. This is a beautiful part of the country, full of dense forests and mountains and small towns that seem stuck in an earlier era. I had been hiking for several hours along trails that varied from well-maintained to barely visible, just enjoying the exercise and the solitude and the beauty of nature all around me. I had brought a backpack with water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and my camera. I was not following any particular route or trying to reach any specific destination. I was just wandering, letting my feet take me wherever looked interesting, secure in the knowledge that I had a compass and a general sense of direction that would eventually lead me back to where I had parked my car. The afternoon sun was filtering through the trees in that particular way that makes everything look golden and magical, creating patches of light and shadow on the forest floor. I was walking through an area where the trees were particularly dense, where the undergrowth was thick with ferns and bushes, when I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. At first it was just a shape in the distance, something angular and geometric that did not belong in the organic curves and irregular patterns of the natural forest. As I moved closer, weaving my way through the trees and pushing aside branches, the shape resolved itself into something unmistakable. It was a house, an actual house, standing alone in the middle of the woods, miles from any road or other building that I had seen. My heart immediately started beating faster with excitement. This was exactly the kind of discovery I lived for. An abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, probably forgotten by everyone, except maybe some elderly locals who might dimly remember that someone used to live out here decades ago. I approached slowly, already thinking about the photographs I would take, the story I would try to piece together from whatever clues I might find. As I got closer to the house, I could see that it was old, but had once been well maintained. It was a simple structure, probably built sometime in the early 20th century. The kind of modest family home that hard-working people would have been proud to own. It was 2 stories tall with a peaked roof, and what looked like wooden siding that had once been painted, but had now faded to a weathered gray. The first thing I noticed was the pathway leading to the front of the house. It had been made from stones, flat rocks that had been carefully laid to create a walkable surface from the edge of the clearing to the front porch. But now those stones were barely visible beneath layers of weeds and wild grass and creeping vines. Nature was slowly reclaiming the path, covering the evidence of human effort and intention with its own patient growth. The house itself was surrounded by grass that had grown tall and wild, reaching up past my knees in some places. Tree branches that had fallen during storms over the years lay scattered around the property, some of them leaning against the walls of the house, others partially buried in the overgrown vegetation. It was clear that no one had maintained this property in a very long time. No one had mowed the grass or cleared the fallen branches, or trimmed back the bushes that were now pressing against the walls of the house as if trying to pull it back into the earth. I made my way through the overgrown yard to the front porch, stepping carefully over branches and pushing aside the tall grass. The porch was small, just big enough for maybe 2 chairs and a small table. The kind of porch where a family might sit in the evening to enjoy the cool air after a hot day. It was made of bricks that had once been neatly laid but were now covered with a thick layer of moss, soft and green and slightly damp to the touch. The moss had grown so thick that it obscured the original color and texture of the bricks, transforming the porch into something that looked more like a natural outcropping than a human construction. I stood on that moss-covered porch and felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was excitement at finding this place, curiosity about what might be inside, but also a growing sense of sadness. Someone had built this house with care and effort. Someone had laid these bricks, had planted those stones in the pathway, had chosen this spot in the woods to make a home. And now it was abandoned and forgotten, slowly being consumed by the forest. The front door was intact, made of solid wood that had weathered to a silvery gray. I tried the handle, knowing it would probably be locked, but checking anyway out of habit. Sure enough, the door was locked, and when I pushed against it to test the strength of the lock, the door did not budge at all. It was locked from the inside, which suggested that whoever had left this place had done so through the door and then locked it behind them, or perhaps had never left at all, and might still be inside, though that thought was too disturbing to seriously consider. I moved along the front of the house, examining the windows. There were several of them across the front wall, traditional double-hung windows with wooden frames. But they were all covered with such a thick layer of dust and dirt and grime on the inside that I could not see through them at all. It was like trying to look through frosted glass, except instead of frost it was decades of accumulated dust, and the dirt that blows around inside abandoned buildings. I tried to open a couple of the windows, thinking that maybe if I could get one open I could climb through and explore the interior of the house. But the wood frames had warped and swelled from years of exposure to moisture and temperature changes. None of the windows would budge, no matter how hard I pulled on them. They were effectively sealed shut by time and decay. I stood there on the front porch for a moment, frustrated, but not yet ready to give up. I had come this far, had found this incredible abandoned house in the middle of the woods, and I was not going to just walk away without at least trying to see what was inside. I decided to walk around the house to check the other sides, to see if there might be another entrance or a window I could look through. I stepped off the front porch and began making my way around the side of the house, pushing through more overgrown vegetation and stepping over more fallen branches. The side of the house had no doors and only a couple of small windows that were positioned too high for me to easily reach. I continued around to the back of the house, where the yard seemed even more overgrown than the front, if that was possible. Back here there were no stone pathways at all, Just wild grass and weeds and small trees that had begun to grow right up against the back wall of the house. But back here I found something promising. There was a window at about eye level that was significantly less dirty than the ones on the front of the house. Maybe this window faced a direction that got less rain, or maybe for some reason the inside of this particular room had accumulated less dust. Whatever the reason, when I stepped up close to this window and cupped my hands around my eyes to block out the sunlight, I could actually see through it, though not very clearly. What I could see was tantalizing. There appeared to be an area rug on the floor, the kind with decorative patterns that people used to put in every room before wall-to-wall carpeting became common. And beside the window there appeared to be a small table or stand of some kind. The details were fuzzy and hard to make out through the dirty glass, but it was enough to confirm that the house was indeed furnished, that whoever had lived here had not emptied the place before leaving. This discovery made me even more determined to get inside. I moved away from the window and looked for the back door. I found it on the side of the house that faced deeper into the woods. A simple wooden door similar to the front door, but without any porch or covered area to protect it from the weather. Like the front door, this one was locked when I tried the handle. But unlike the front door, this back door had a weakness. When I pushed against it gently, testing it the same way I had tested the front door, I could feel that something was different. The door moved slightly, just a fraction of an inch, and I could feel the frame shift. The wood of the door frame had rotted over the years, weakened by moisture and insects and time. The lock was still engaged, but the frame itself was compromised. I stood there for a moment, debating with myself. What I was about to do was definitely breaking and entering. An actual crime that could get me arrested if anyone found out. But I rationalized it to myself in several ways. First, it was obvious that no one had been to this house in many, many years. No one was maintaining it, no one was checking on it, and probably no one even remembered it existed anymore. Second, I was not planning to steal anything or damage anything. I just wanted to look around, to document what was there, to try to understand the story of this place. Third, if I did not go inside, if I just walked away, I would regret it forever. I would lie awake at night wondering what I had missed, what secrets this house held, what story it could have told me. I made my decision. I positioned myself in front of the back door, placed my hands flat against it, and pushed hard. The rotted frame gave way with a cracking sound that seemed terribly loud in the quiet forest. The door swung inward, the lock mechanism still engaged but now useless because the frame it was attached to had broken. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dimmer light inside. The smell hit me immediately. That distinctive odor of old enclosed spaces, a combination of dust and mold and decay, and something else. Something that I could not quite identify, but that made me slightly uneasy. It was not the smell of death. I had encountered that before in other abandoned places, and I knew what it was like. This was different. Just the smell of a place that had been closed up and forgotten for decades. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was standing in a kitchen, and what I saw made me catch my breath in amazement. This was not just an abandoned house with a few pieces of furniture left behind. This was a house where people had simply walked away from their lives midstream, leaving everything exactly as it was on what must have been an ordinary day. The kitchen was small but functional, with cabinets along one wall, a sink with a window above it, and a small table with 4 chairs in the center of the room. And everything, absolutely everything, was still in place as if the family had just stepped out for a moment and would be returning any minute. There were dirty dishes in the sink, plates and cups and utensils that had been used for a meal and then left to be washed later. On the counter beside the sink was a drain board, and on that drain board were glasses and cups that had been washed and turned upside down to dry. exactly as my grandmother used to do before the invention of dishwashers became common in every home. But these glasses had never been put away. They had sat on that drain board for decades, slowly accumulating a thick layer of dust that now covered them completely, transforming them from transparent glass into opaque objects that looked like they were made of gray stone. On the small kitchen table were drinking glasses, 2 of them, positioned as if 2 people had been sitting there having a drink and conversation. And beside one of the glasses was a newspaper, folded open to a particular page, the way someone might fold a paper when they are reading a specific article. I moved closer to look at the newspaper, careful not to touch it, because the paper looked so brittle and fragile that I was afraid it might crumble at the slightest contact. The date on the newspaper was clearly visible despite the yellowing and aging of the paper. June 1959. This newspaper was more than 60 years old, sitting on this kitchen table where someone had left it more than 6 decades ago. The realization sent chills down my spine. This house had been abandoned for more than 60 years, sitting here in the woods while the world moved on, while technology advanced, while generations of people were born and lived and died, while wars were fought and ended, while everything changed. But in this house, time had stopped in June of 1959. I turned my attention to the cabinets that lined one wall of the kitchen. I opened them carefully, half expecting them to be empty, but they were not empty at all. They were stocked with dishes, cups, bowls, plates, everything a family would need for daily life. The dishes were covered in dust, of course, like everything else in the house, but they were neatly organized on the shelves, arranged by size and type in a way that spoke of someone who took pride in maintaining an orderly home. Next to the kitchen cabinets was a tall pantry, the old-fashioned kind with multiple shelves for storing food. I opened the pantry door, which creaked loudly on hinges that had not moved in decades, and found something that was both wonderful and sad. The shelves were lined with glass jars, mason jars of the type that people used for home canning. These jars contained what had once been preserves and fruits and vegetables, carefully prepared and canned by hand by someone who wanted to preserve the harvest from their garden to feed their family through the winter months. But now the contents of these jars were unrecognizable, transformed by time into dark, decomposed masses that no longer resembled food. Some of the jars had cracked, or the seals had failed, allowing air in, and their contents had dried out or grown mold. Others were still sealed, and their contents were still liquid. But the liquid was now dark and cloudy and filled with floating particles. These jars represented hours of labor, someone standing over a hot stove in summer, carefully preparing and processing these foods, probably feeling satisfaction at having provided for their family. And now it was all waste, never eaten, never enjoyed, just slowly rotting in this forgotten pantry. The sight of those jars made me feel unbearably sad. More than anything else I had seen so far, those jars of spoiled preserves drove home the tragedy and mystery of this place. Someone had worked hard, had planned for the future, had prepared to feed their family for months to come. And then something had happened. Something that meant none of this food was ever eaten, none of this preparation and effort mattered. I left the kitchen and moved deeper into the house. The layout was simple and typical of houses from that era. From the kitchen I entered a short hallway that led to other rooms. The first room I came to appeared to be the living room, the main space where the family would have gathered to relax and spend time together. This room was furnished with a sofa and 2 chairs arranged around a small area rug, the same rug I had glimpsed through the window from outside. There was a coffee table in front of the sofa, and on that table was a magazine, open to a page, showing advertisements for products that no longer existed. Against one wall was what looked like a radio cabinet, the kind of large piece of furniture that housed a radio and perhaps a record player, from the days before televisions became common in every home. Everything in this room was covered with the same thick layer of dust that had covered everything in the kitchen. But underneath that dust, the furniture looked to be in relatively good condition, considering how much time had passed. The fabric on the sofa and chairs had faded and showed signs of deterioration, with some areas where the material had weakened and torn. But overall, if you could somehow remove the dust and the damage from decades of abandonment, this could still look like a lived-in room. What struck me most as I stood in that living room was how normal everything looked. This was not a fancy or wealthy home. This was a modest, working-class family's house, furnished with simple but functional furniture, decorated in the plain style typical of rural American homes in the 1950s. There were no signs of luxury or wealth, but also no signs of poverty or desperation. This looked like the home of people who worked hard, took care of what they had, and lived simple, decent lives. I moved through the house systematically, going from room to room, documenting everything with my camera and my eyes. I found 2 bedrooms on the first floor. The first one I entered was clearly a children's room. It had 2 twin beds, positioned against opposite walls. Each bed perfectly made up with blankets and pillows, as if the children had made their beds in the morning before going to school, and then never came back to sleep in them again. The bedding was in very poor condition after decades of exposure to humidity and insects and time. The blankets had faded and developed holes in places. The pillows had gone flat and showed signs of having been used as nesting material by mice or other small animals that had found their way into the house over the years. But underneath the damage and decay, I could see that the bedding had been handmade, probably stitched by the mother of the family, each stitch representing care and love for her children. In this children's room there were other signs of young lives interrupted. There was a small dresser with several drawers, and when I carefully pulled open the drawers I found children's clothes, neatly folded and organized. But many of these clothes had been chewed and nested in by mice, leaving holes and scattered bits of fabric. On top of the dresser were a few small toys, the simple kind that children played with before the age of electronic games and plastic action figures. A wooden top, some marbles in a small bag, a doll with a porcelain face and cloth body. The closet in the children's room contained more clothes hanging on a rod, including several dresses that appeared to be handmade, stitched together from printed cotton fabric in the style typical of that era. One dress in particular caught my attention, a small girl's dress with a floral pattern. I pulled it gently from the hanger to examine it more closely, and I could see the careful stitching, the hand-finished seams, the small details that indicated this dress had been made with love by someone who cared about the child who would wear it. But now the dress was deteriorating, with holes eaten by insects and stains from moisture and mold. The second bedroom appeared to be the parents' room. It contained just one bed, a double bed, also perfectly made up with blankets and pillows. The furniture in this room was similar to that in the children's room, simple and functional. A dresser with a mirror, a wardrobe for hanging clothes, a small table beside the bed that might have held a lamp and an alarm clock, and perhaps a book for reading before sleep. I opened the drawers in the parents' dresser and found adult clothing, both men's and women's, neatly organized and carefully stored. In the wardrobe hung more clothes, dresses and shirts and pants, all showing signs of age and decay but still recognizable. These clothes were also handmade. At least many of them were. Speaking to a time when buying ready-made clothing was expensive, and many people, especially in rural areas, still made at least some of their own clothes. I found a bathroom as well, small and basic but functional. The cabinet in the bathroom still contained toiletries, things that people use every day without thinking about them. There was a straight-edge razor, the kind that men used before disposable razors became common. There were a few bottles and containers that probably once held soap or shampoo or other personal care products, though most of the contents had long since dried up or evaporated. There were towels, neatly folded on a shelf, though they had now become nests for small animals, and were no longer recognizable as towels in some cases. By this point, I had been in the house for probably 30 minutes, maybe longer. I had been so absorbed in examining everything, in trying to take in every detail, that I had lost track of time. But now I was starting to feel uncomfortable, and not just because of the dust and the smell and the decay. I was starting to feel like I was being watched. Like there were eyes on me, even though I knew intellectually that I was alone in this abandoned house. It is hard to explain this feeling to someone who has never experienced it. It was not that I heard anything or saw anything specific that made me think there was another presence in the house. It was just a growing sense of unease, a feeling that I was intruding somewhere I should not be, that I was disturbing something that should have been left undisturbed. The rational part of my brain told me this was just my imagination, just the natural human response to being in a creepy abandoned place. But the feeling was strong enough that I decided it was time to leave soon. Before I left, though, I wanted to check one more thing. I had noticed as I moved through the house that there were various pictures hanging on the walls, frames that contained what I assumed were family photographs, or perhaps prints of art or scenery. Everything was so covered in dust and the glass in the frames was so dirty that I had not been able to see clearly what the pictures showed. But I thought if I could clean off some of the dust, I might be able to see the photographs and get some sense of who this family had been, what they had looked like, whether the images would give me any clues about what might have happened to them. I walked through the short hallway that connected the bedrooms to the living room, and on the wall of this hallway hung several framed pictures. I chose one that was hanging near the doorway of what had been the parents' bedroom, a frame that seemed to be about the right size for a formal photograph. I gently wiped some of the dust off the glass with my sleeve, trying to be careful not to damage the frame or the picture inside. What emerged from beneath the dust was a wedding photograph. It was very faded, the chemicals in the photographic paper having degraded over the decades, and there appeared to be some kind of mildew or fungus growing behind the glass, creating dark spots and patterns that obscured parts of the image. But I could still make out the basic content of the photograph. A young man and a young woman, dressed in what must have been their wedding clothes, though they were not fancy or elaborate. The man wore a suit that looked slightly too large for him, and the woman wore a simple dress, probably the best dress she owned. They were both smiling, both looking young and happy and hopeful, standing together at the start of their married life with no idea of what the future would bring. Looking at that photograph, at those two young people smiling out from 60, some years in the past, made my throat tight with emotion. These were real people who had real dreams and hopes. They had gotten married, probably in a small ceremony with family and friends. They had set up this house together, had worked to make it a home. They had brought children into the world and raised them in this house. And then something had happened, something that ended all of it, that caused this family to vanish, and this house to be abandoned. I moved into the living room to examine more of the pictures hanging there. Most of them were exactly what I expected, scenes of nature or still life images. The kind of inexpensive prints that people bought to decorate their homes. But near the front door hung another photograph. A family portrait, and this one I knew I needed to see clearly. I wiped the dust off this frame as well, more carefully this time, because the photograph underneath seemed to be in even worse condition than the wedding photo. The paper was badly faded, and there were large areas where the image had almost completely disappeared. But I could still make out the essential elements of the photograph. It showed the entire family. The man from the wedding photo, now a few years older, wearing working clothes and a serious expression. The woman from the wedding photo, also older, wearing a simple dress and holding something in her arms. 2 children sitting on the floor at their parents' feet, a boy and a girl perhaps, though it was hard to tell for certain given the condition of the photograph. And in the mother's arms, what appeared to be a very small infant. Just a tiny baby wrapped in a blanket. I stood staring at this photograph for a long time, feeling increasingly unsettled. There had been 5 people in this family. A mother and father and 2 older children, and a baby. I had seen clear evidence of the parents and the 2 older children throughout the house. Their clothes, their beds, their possessions. But I had seen no evidence at all of a baby. No crib, no baby clothes, no diapers or bottles or any of the things that would be necessary for caring for an infant. It was as if the baby in the photograph had never existed, or had existed only briefly before disappearing without a trace. This realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature in the abandoned house. What had happened to that baby? What had happened to this entire family? Why had they left this house so suddenly, apparently in the middle of an ordinary day, leaving their dishes in the sink, and their newspaper on the table, and their beds made up, and their clothes in the closets? The questions swirled in my mind, each one leading to more questions, none of them with any answers. Had there been some kind of tragedy? Had the baby died, and the family been so grief-stricken that they abandoned their home and started over somewhere else? But that did not make sense. People in the 1950s did not just abandon their homes. Houses were valuable, and these were clearly not wealthy people who could afford to just walk away from their property. Had there been some kind of accident or disaster? Had the parents and children left the house one day for work and school and errands, planning to come home that evening, only to be killed in a car accident or some other tragedy? But then who had locked the doors? And surely someone would have come to the house to collect the family's belongings, whether that was other family members or the authorities or someone. Had the family fled from something? Had they been in danger and had to leave immediately, taking only what they could carry and abandoning everything else? But who would they have been fleeing from in rural New Hampshire in 1959? And again, why would no one ever come back, not even decades later when whatever danger they had fled from would presumably be long past? The more I thought about it, the less sense any explanation made. Every scenario I could imagine had holes in it, had aspects that did not fit with what I was seeing in this house. It was a genuine mystery, and one that I had no way of solving standing here in this abandoned living room 60-some years after whatever had happened had happened. I took several photographs with my camera, documenting the rooms and the furniture, and the wedding photo, and the family portrait. I wanted to have these images to study later, to share with others, to perhaps use to try to identify this family and discover what had become of them. But as I took these photographs, my feeling of unease continued to grow. I felt more strongly than ever that I was being watched, that I should not be here, that I needed to leave. I made my way back through the house toward the back door where I had entered. As I walked through that short hallway one more time, I glanced at the other pictures hanging there. But I did not stop to examine them more closely. I just wanted to get out of this house, to get back into the fresh air and sunlight, to leave behind the dust and decay and the oppressive atmosphere of this place where time had stopped. I stepped out through the broken back door into the overgrown yard and immediately felt better. The fresh air and the sounds of the forest, birds singing and wind moving through the trees, helped to dispel some of the unease I had been feeling inside. I took several deep breaths, trying to clear the smell of the abandoned house from my lungs. I walked around to the front of the house one more time, taking a few photographs of the exterior to document the full context of this place. Then I made my way back through the overgrown yard to the edge of the forest where the trees began. I stopped and turned back to look at the house one more time. From this distance it looked almost peaceful. Just a small house, sitting in a clearing in the woods, surrounded by nature. You could not see the decay and the dust and the abandoned lives from out here. You could almost imagine that it was occupied, that a family lived there, that in the evening smoke would rise from the chimney, and lights would glow in the windows, and children would play in the yard. But I knew better. I had been inside. I had seen what was there. This was not a home anymore. It was a monument to a mystery, a testament to lives that had been interrupted and then forgotten, a place where time had stopped and the past remained frozen and inaccessible. I have never been back to that house, and I never intend to go back. Just thinking about it makes me uncomfortable, makes me feel that same unease I felt standing in the living room looking at the family photograph. It was not a house I found that day. It was a home. A place where real people had lived real lives, had experienced joys and sorrows, had worked and played, and slept, and eaten and raised their children. And then they had disappeared, leaving everything behind, and apparently no one had ever come looking for them, or caring enough to wonder what had become of their possessions. That is perhaps the saddest part of all. This family vanished, and it seems that the world simply forgot about them. Their house sat in the woods for more than 60 years, slowly decaying, slowly being reclaimed by nature, and no one noticed or cared. No relatives came to claim the property or the belongings. No authorities came to investigate the abandoned home. No one put up a historical marker or tried to preserve this piece of the past. It was just forgotten, erased from memory, as if this family had never existed at all. I have thought many times about trying to research this family, about going to local historical societies, or libraries, or county records offices to try to find out who lived in that house, and what happened to them. But I have never actually done it. Part of me is afraid of what I might find, or more accurately, afraid that I might not find anything at all. That there might be no record of this family, no explanation for their disappearance. And part of me feels like maybe some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries. That maybe I stumbled upon something I was never meant to find, and that I should just leave it alone. But I cannot stop thinking about that family. I think about the mother who made those dresses for her daughter, who canned those preserves, who washed those dishes and left them on the drain board to dry. I think about the father who read that newspaper at the kitchen table, who locked the doors when the family left the house for the last time. I think about the children who made their beds so neatly, who played with those simple toys, who wore those handmade clothes. And most of all, I think about the baby, the tiny infant in the family photograph, the child for whom I found no evidence anywhere in that house. What happened to them? Where did they go? Did they leave voluntarily or were they taken? Did they die suddenly in some accident or disaster, or did they simply start new lives somewhere else? Are there descendants of this family alive today who have no idea that their ancestors' home still stands in the woods of New Hampshire, perfectly preserved like a museum exhibit of 1950s rural life? These questions have no answers. At least no answers that I have been able to find. And so the mystery remains, and probably always will remain. The house is still there, I assume, unless it has finally collapsed under the weight of time, or been demolished by someone who discovered it. The dishes are probably still in the sink, the newspaper still on the table, the bed still made up, the clothes still hanging in the closets. Time continues to move forward in the rest of the world, but in that house in the woods, it is still June 1959, and it always will be. I found a home that day, hidden deep in the woods of northern New Hampshire. Not just a building or a structure, but a place where people lived, and loved, and raised a family. And then those people vanished, leaving their home behind like a time capsule, a window into a past that we can look at but never truly understand. That is the mystery I carry with me, the question that keeps me awake at night, the story that I will never know the ending to. And maybe that is how it should be. Maybe some stories are not meant to have endings. Maybe some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Maybe the lesson here is simply to remember that every abandoned place was once someone's home, that every forgotten building held lives and dreams and hopes that matter just as much as our lives and dreams and hopes matter today. We are all just passing through this world, leaving traces that will eventually be forgotten, creating stories that will eventually have no one left to tell them. The house in the woods is my reminder of this truth. It sits there still, waiting for the forest to finally reclaim it completely, waiting for the last traces of the family who lived there to fade away into nothing. And when that day comes, when the house finally collapses and the forest grows over the ruins, the mystery will remain, preserved not in the physical structure, but in the memory of those few people like me who stumbled upon it and wondered about the lives that were lived there, and the questions that will never be answered. That is my story. That is what I found in the woods of northern New Hampshire. A mystery wrapped in dust and decay, a family frozen in time, a question with no answer. And I will carry it with me for the rest of my life. Next one story start now. The sound in the darkness. There are nights that stay with you forever. Nights that become burned into your memory so deeply that even years later you can recall every single detail with perfect clarity. Nights when something happens that you cannot explain, cannot rationalize, cannot fit into your understanding of how the world is supposed to work. I experienced such a night back in 2018 or 2019. I cannot remember the exact year anymore, but I remember everything else about that night as if it happened yesterday. The fear, the confusion, the sense that reality itself had become unstable and unreliable. Even now, years later, I do not know what really happened that night. I do not know if what I experienced was real, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. All I know is that it felt absolutely real in the moment, and the memory of it still has the power to make my heart race and my hands shake. Before I tell you about that night, I need to give you some context about who I was at the time and where this happened. I was just a child back then, maybe 10 or 11 years old. I was at that age where you are not quite a little kid anymore, but you are also not yet a teenager. You are old enough to understand that the world can be scary, but young enough that you still believe in the possibility of monsters and ghosts and things that go bump in the night. I was staying at my grandmother's house, which was something I did often during school vacations or long weekends. My grandmother lived in a house that was old but comfortable, the kind of place where multiple generations of a family had lived and left their marks. It was a 2-story house, and the layout was simple. Downstairs there was a living room, a kitchen, and a small bathroom. Upstairs there were 3 bedrooms connected by a hallway and a staircase that led down to the main floor. I always slept in the same room when I stayed at my grandmother's house, the middle bedroom that had been my mother's room when she was growing up. My grandmother would sleep in the same room with me, in another bed positioned against the opposite wall. She did this partly to keep me company because I was still young enough to sometimes feel scared sleeping alone, and partly because she enjoyed having me close by. We would talk before going to sleep, sharing stories and laughing together. And then we would drift off in the comfortable darkness, secure in each other's presence. The house itself was located in a neighborhood that was quiet and safe, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and children could play outside without their parents worrying too much. During the day, the house was bright and cheerful, filled with the sounds of family life and the smells of my grandmother's cooking. But at night, like most houses, it took on a different character. The familiar spaces became shadowy and mysterious. The creaks and groans of an old house settling became noticeable in the silence. And if you were a child with an active imagination, it was easy to start thinking about what might be hiding in the darkness. The night that I want to tell you about happened during winter. I remember this clearly because it was very cold outside. The kind of deep winter cold that makes you want to stay bundled under blankets, and never leave the warmth of your bed. My grandmother and I had gone to bed at our usual time, probably around 9 or 9:30 in the evening. We had talked for a little while in the darkness, and then we had both drifted off to sleep. I do not know exactly what time it was when the dream started, but based on what happened afterward, it must have been close to midnight. The dream was vivid and strange. The kind of dream that feels almost real while you are experiencing it. In the dream, I was looking at outer space, seeing stars and planets and the vast darkness between them. Then I saw an astronaut floating alone on the moon, a tiny human figure against the gray lunar landscape. The image shifted and I saw a planet, beautiful and colorful, hanging in space. And then suddenly, without warning, the planet exploded. It was not a quiet or gradual explosion. It was violent and catastrophic, with light and debris flying outward in all directions. The explosion was so bright that it seemed to fill the entire dream, washing everything out in white light. And then, there was nothing. The light faded, the explosion disappeared, and I found myself in complete darkness. Not the darkness of space, but a different kind of darkness. An empty void where nothing existed. And then I woke up. My heart was pounding hard in my chest, and I could feel sweat on my forehead despite the cold temperature in the room. The dream had frightened me, though I could not have explained exactly why. There was something about the violence of that exploding planet, about the sudden transition from beauty to destruction, that had shaken me deeply. I lay there in the darkness of the bedroom, trying to calm my racing heart, trying to convince myself that it was just a dream, and that dreams could not hurt me. I could hear my grandmother's steady breathing from her bed across the room. She was still sound asleep, undisturbed by whatever had awakened me. The house around us was silent, or at least it seemed silent at first. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep, tried to find that comfortable darkness that would lead me into peaceful, dreamless rest. But then I heard something that made my eyes snap open again. It was a sound coming from outside the bedroom, from somewhere in the hallway or perhaps on the staircase that led down to the first floor. At first I could not identify what the sound was, but it was definitely there, definitely real, not something I was imagining. The sound lasted for about a minute, maybe a little longer. Then it stopped. And in that sudden silence, my heart sank, and my brain seemed to freeze. I lay there completely still, barely breathing, straining my ears to hear if the sound would come again. And it did come again. After perhaps 30 seconds of silence, the sound started up once more. This time I focused on it more carefully, trying to understand what I was hearing. It was a rustling sound, like someone opening a plastic bag and reaching inside to take something out. There was a crinkling quality to it, the distinctive sound that plastic makes when it is being handled. And mixed in with that rustling was another sound, a crunching sound, like someone eating something crispy or breaking something brittle. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to find a rational explanation for what I was hearing. Could it be an animal that had somehow gotten into the house? But what kind of animal would be making that specific sound? Could it be my grandmother's cat? But I knew the cat slept downstairs and would not have climbed the stairs to the second floor at night. Could it be someone who had broken into the house? The thought sent a wave of terror through me, but it also did not quite fit. A burglar would not just sit on the stairs eating something from a plastic bag. That made no sense. The sound continued. It did not stop after a minute this time. It kept going, on and on, that same pattern of rustling and crunching, rustling and crunching. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand and watched as the minutes ticked by. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The sound just kept coming, never stopping, never changing its rhythm or pattern. I was trembling now, actually physically shaking under my blanket. I wanted to call out to my grandmother, to wake her up and tell her that something was wrong, that there was something outside our room making strange sounds. But I was too scared to raise my voice above a whisper. What if whatever was out there heard me? What if calling out would draw its attention to me? As the sound continued, I found myself becoming almost hypnotized by it. My fear did not decrease, but it was joined by an intense curiosity. What was making that sound? I needed to know. My brain kept trying to solve the puzzle, kept running through every possible explanation. But nothing fit. Nothing made sense. And then, after the sound had been going on continuously for about 10 minutes, something even more frightening happened. I felt a presence in the room with me. I cannot explain exactly how I knew someone or something was there. I did not see anything. The room was dark, and I was lying with my face turned toward the ceiling, not looking around. But I felt it with absolute certainty. There was something beside my bed, standing close enough that if I reached out my hand I would touch it. The feeling was overwhelming and terrifying. My entire body went rigid with fear. I could not move, could not scream, could not do anything except lie there frozen while whatever it was stood beside me. The sound from outside the room was still continuing, that endless rustling and crunching, but now there was also this presence right next to me, and the combination of the two things was almost more than my child's mind could handle. I do not know how long I lay there like that, paralyzed with terror, feeling this invisible presence beside me, while the sounds continued from the hallway. It might have been seconds, or minutes, or longer. Time seemed to have stopped having any meaning. All that existed was my fear, and the sound, and the presence. Finally, desperately, I found my voice. I whispered to my grandmother, who was still sleeping peacefully in her bed across the room, completely unaware of what I was experiencing. My voice came out small and weak, barely more than a breath. "Grandma," I whispered. "Grandma, someone is beside me. There is someone here." But my grandmother did not wake up. Or if she did wake up slightly, she did not process what I had said. She made a small sound, shifted in her bed, and then her breathing returned to the steady rhythm of sleep. I had tried to get help and had failed. I was alone with my fear and the presence and the sound. I lay there, and gradually something began to change. The feeling of the presence beside me started to fade. It was not a sudden disappearance, but a slow fading, like fog gradually dissipating in sunlight. And as the presence faded, I noticed that the sound from the hallway was also getting quieter, becoming less frequent, less intense. At the same time, I felt my own body beginning to relax. The terrible tension that had held me rigid was loosening. My muscles unclenched. My breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to slow down. And my eyes, which had been wide open and staring into the darkness, began to feel heavy. I was suddenly overwhelmingly tired. More tired than I could ever remember being. It was as if all the fear and adrenaline that had been keeping me alert and awake had suddenly drained away, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion. My eyelids drooped. I tried to keep them open, tried to stay vigilant, but I could not fight the wave of sleep that was washing over me. The sound from the hallway was almost gone now, just occasional faint rustlings that might have been real, or might have been my imagination. The presence beside my bed was completely gone, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. And I was falling into darkness, into sleep, into unconsciousness that swallowed me completely. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window, and I could hear my grandmother moving around in the room, getting dressed and preparing for the day. I sat up in bed, feeling confused and disoriented. Had last night really happened? Had I really heard those sounds and felt that presence? Or had it all been part of a dream, an extension of the nightmare about the exploding planet that had awakened me? I looked around the room. Everything looked completely normal. My grandmother's bed was neatly made. The room was bright and cheerful in the morning light. There was no sign that anything unusual had happened during the night. I got out of bed and went to the doorway of the room, looking out into the hallway and down the staircase. Nothing. Just an ordinary hallway and staircase in an ordinary house on an ordinary morning. I wanted to ask my grandmother if she had heard anything during the night, but I did not know how to bring it up. How do you explain to an adult that you heard strange sounds and felt an invisible presence beside your bed? She would think I had just had a nightmare. She would tell me that I had been dreaming and that everything was fine. And maybe she would be right. Maybe it had all been a dream or a hallucination, or the product of an overactive imagination. So I said nothing. I kept the experience to myself, locked it away in my memory where it has remained ever since. I have never told anyone about that night. Not my grandmother, not my parents, not my friends. It has been my secret, my mystery, my question without an answer. But even though I have never talked about it, I have never forgotten it either. That night is as clear in my memory now as it was when it happened. I can still recall the exact quality of the sounds I heard, that rustling and crunching that went on for so long. I can still remember the feeling of the presence beside my bed, the absolute certainty that something was there even though I could not see it. I can still feel the terror that paralyzed me and the exhaustion that finally pulled me into sleep. Over the years since that night, I have tried many times to figure out what really happened. I have come up with various theories and explanations, some more rational than others, but none of them have ever felt completely satisfying. The most rational explanation is that it was all a dream, or a series of dreams. Maybe I never really woke up after the nightmare about the exploding planet. Maybe everything else, the sounds, the presence, the attempt to wake my grandmother. Maybe all of that was just part of an extended nightmare that felt real, but was actually happening only in my sleeping mind. This explanation makes sense from a logical standpoint. It fits with what we know about how the brain works, about how dreams can feel incredibly real while we are experiencing them, about how fear can create vivid hallucinations. But this explanation has never felt quite right to me. I know what dreams feel like. I have had many dreams in my life, both before and after that night. And the experience of that night felt different from a dream. It felt more real, more solid, more rooted in actual physical reality. When I remember it, it does not have that hazy, disconnected quality that dream memories have. It feels like a memory of something that actually happened. Another possible explanation is sleep paralysis. This is a condition where a person wakes up but cannot move, and often experiences hallucinations, including feelings of a presence in the room, and sometimes auditory hallucinations as well. Sleep paralysis is a real, documented phenomenon, and it could potentially explain many aspects of what I experienced that night. The feeling of being frozen and unable to move, the sense of a presence beside the bed, even possibly the sounds I heard. All of these could be symptoms of sleep paralysis. But this explanation also has problems. Sleep paralysis typically lasts only a few minutes, whereas my experience seemed to go on for much longer, maybe 15 or 20 minutes or more. And people experiencing sleep paralysis are usually aware that they cannot move, whereas I never felt paralyzed in the sense of being unable to move. I was frozen by fear, certainly, but I could move my eyes. I could whisper to my grandmother. I could breathe and think. It was not the total paralysis that characterizes the classic sleep paralysis experience. A third possibility is that there really was something making noise in the hallway. Some perfectly ordinary explanation that my child's imagination transformed into something frightening. Maybe there was an animal after all. Perhaps a mouse or a rat, that had gotten into the house and was gnawing on something or rustling through some material. Maybe there was a draft or some air current that was causing something to move and make noise. Maybe the house was settling or shifting in the cold weather, creating sounds that I misinterpreted. This explanation could account for the sounds, but it does not explain the feeling of the presence beside my bed. It does not explain why the sounds went on for so long, or why they had such a specific, repetitive pattern. And it does not explain the strange timing of everything. The way the presence appeared just as the sounds were continuing, and the way both the presence and the sounds faded at the same time as I was falling back asleep. There is also, of course, a supernatural explanation. Maybe what I experienced that night was real in a way that goes beyond normal physical reality. Maybe there was something in that house, some spirit or entity or force that was making itself known to me. Maybe the presence I felt beside my bed was not my imagination, but an actual being from some other realm of existence. Maybe the sounds were not produced by anything physical, but were manifestations of something beyond our normal understanding. I have to admit that as much as my rational mind resists this explanation, part of me believes it might be true. The experience felt supernatural. It felt like I was in the presence of something that did not belong to the ordinary world. And no rational explanation has ever fully satisfied me or made me feel like I truly understand what happened that night. In the years since that experience, I have read many accounts of other people who have had similar experiences. Stories of people waking up in the night and hearing unexplained sounds. Stories of people feeling unseen presences in their rooms. Stories of fear and confusion and the inability to know what is real and what is not. Reading these accounts has been both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it makes me feel less alone. Less like there is something wrong with me for having had this experience. Unsettling because it raises the question of what all these people are experiencing. Are we all just having similar nightmares or hallucinations? Or is there something real happening? Something that many people encounter but few can explain. I have also thought a lot about the dream that preceded the strange events of that night. The dream of the astronaut on the moon and the exploding planet. Was that dream connected to what happened afterward? Was it some kind of premonition or warning? Or was it just a coincidence? A random nightmare that happened to occur before I woke up and experienced something frightening. The exploding planet in my dream has taken on symbolic significance in my mind over the years. I think of it as representing the destruction of my safe, comfortable reality. Before that night, I believed that I understood how the world worked. I believed that scary things only happened in stories and movies, not in real life, not in my grandmother's comfortable bedroom. But that night shattered that belief. It showed me that there are experiences in this world that we cannot explain or control. That there are moments when reality itself seems to become unstable and unreliable. Looking back now as an adult, I can see that night as a kind of loss of innocence. It was the night when I learned that the world is stranger and more frightening than I had thought. It was the night when I learned that there are questions without answers and experiences without explanations. It was the night when I learned that sometimes you can be absolutely certain that something is real, while simultaneously being unable to prove it or even to convince yourself that it actually happened. The memory of that night has affected me in various ways over the years. For a long time afterward, I was afraid to sleep alone. I would lie awake in the darkness, listening to every sound, interpreting every creak and rustle as potential evidence of another supernatural visitation. I would feel my heart racing and my body tensing, waiting for that feeling of a presence beside my bed to return. Eventually, the acute fear faded. I learned to sleep normally again, to not be constantly on alert for strange sounds or invisible presences. But the memory remained, and it has shaped how I think about reality and experience. I am more open-minded now than I might otherwise have been. I am less quick to dismiss other people's strange experiences, or to insist that everything must have a rational explanation. I know from my own experience that there are events in this world that do not fit neatly into our categories, that resist our attempts to explain them. I have also become more interested in the nature of consciousness and perception. How do we know what is real? How can we distinguish between experiences that are objective, external reality, and experiences that are products of our own minds? The line between the two is less clear than we usually think. Our brains are constantly constructing a model of reality based on sensory input, memory, expectation, and emotion. That model is usually accurate enough to allow us to function in the world, but sometimes it can be distorted or corrupted. Sometimes we can experience things that feel absolutely real, but that may have no external existence. That night in my grandmother's house taught me this lesson in a visceral way. I experienced something that felt completely real. The sounds were real to my ears. The presence was real to my senses. The fear was definitely real. But I have no way to know if there was any objective reality corresponding to those experiences. I have no way to prove that what I experienced was anything more than a product of my own brain misfiring in some way. And yet, despite all of this rational analysis, despite all my efforts to explain away what happened that night, I cannot shake the feeling that it was real. Something happened. Something beyond the ordinary. Something that I encountered and survived, but that I will never fully understand. To this day, if someone asks me about the most real horror incident that has ever happened to me, this is the story I think of. Not because I can prove it was real in any objective sense, but because it felt real in a way that nothing else in my life has ever felt. The fear was real. The confusion was real. The sense that I was in the presence of something unknown and potentially dangerous was absolutely real. I still do not know what made those sounds in the hallway that night. I still do not know what created the feeling of a presence beside my bed. I still do not know if I was dreaming or hallucinating, or experiencing something supernatural, or encountering some aspect of reality that science has not yet discovered. All I know is that it happened, or at least that I experienced it happening, and that the memory of it has stayed with me for all these years. Sometimes when I am lying in bed at night, in the moments before sleep, I think about that night. I remember the sound of rustling plastic and crunching. The feeling of something standing beside my bed in the darkness. The desperate whisper to my grandmother that went unanswered. And I wonder if it will ever happen again. Will I ever again experience that particular kind of terror? That sense of reality becoming unstable and unreliable? Part of me hopes not. Part of me never wants to feel that frightened and confused again. But another part of me, a small but persistent part, is curious. If it happened once, could it happen again? And if it did happen again, would I be better prepared this time? Would I have the courage to look at whatever was beside my bed, instead of lying frozen with fear? Would I be able to investigate the source of the sounds instead of hiding under my blanket? Would I be able to learn something about the nature of this experience that might help me understand what really happened that night? I do not know the answers to these questions. All I can do is carry the memory with me, hold on to the details, even as the years pass, and other memories fade. Because even though I cannot explain what happened that night, even though I cannot prove it was real, it matters to me. It is part of my story, part of who I am. It is the night when I learned that the world is stranger than I thought, that there are experiences beyond explanation, that sometimes the most real horror is not knowing what is real and what is not. So that is my story. That is the most real horror incident that has ever happened to me. A cold winter night in my grandmother's house. A nightmare about an exploding planet. A sound in the darkness that went on and on. A presence beside my bed that I could feel, but not see. And a question that has never been answered, that may never be answered, about what really happened during those terrifying minutes in the middle of the night. I have carried this story with me for years, never telling anyone, never seeking validation or explanation. But now I have told you, and maybe that is enough. Maybe the horror of that night is not diminished by being shared, but is instead made bearable by being witnessed, by being acknowledged as something that happened, or at least as something that was experienced, regardless of what objective reality might say about it. The sound in the darkness was real to me. The presence was real to me. The fear was absolutely undeniably real. And that reality, the reality of my experience, is all I can be certain of. Everything else is mystery. Question marks. The unknown territory that exists at the edges of our understanding. And maybe that is the truest horror of all. Not monsters or ghosts or supernatural beings, but the simple fact that there are experiences in this world that we cannot fully understand, cannot explain, cannot fit into our comfortable categories of real and unreal. That night taught me this lesson, and I have never forgotten it. The sound in the darkness, the presence beside the bed, the terror of not knowing. These things are real, even if I can never prove they happen. They are real because I experienced them, because they changed me, because I carry them with me still. And that is the most real horror of all. Next one story start now. The woman on the stairs. There are some encounters that mark you forever. Experiences so terrifying and inexplicable that they become part of your family's history. Stories that get told and retold over the years, never losing their power to make people's skin crawl and their hearts beat faster. What happened to my mother on the night of my great-aunt's funeral is one of those stories. It is a story that has been told at family gatherings, whispered about late at night, debated and discussed and analyzed countless times. But no amount of discussion has ever changed the basic facts of what happened, or made it any less frightening. My mother saw something that night that should not have been possible. Something that defied all logic and reason. Something that still haunts her dreams even now, years after it happened. Before I tell you what my mother experienced that night, I need to give you some background about the woman whose death brought us to the village in the first place. Her name does not matter for this story, so I will just call her what we called her in life, which was Choti Dadi. In our language and culture, this term roughly translates to little grandmother, or younger grandmother, and it was a term of respect and affection for an older female relative. Though in truth, Choti Dadi was not actually that old when she died. She was relatively young, probably in her late 40s or early 50s, which is certainly not old by modern standards. Choti Dadi was my father's aunt, his father's younger brother's wife. She had married into our family many years ago, in a marriage that had been arranged in the traditional way. From what I understood from family gossip and conversations I had overheard over the years, her marriage had not been a happy one. Her husband, my father's uncle, had turned out to be unfaithful. He had carried on an extramarital affair with another woman for many years. An affair that was not exactly secret, but that everyone in the family pretended not to know about, because that is how things were handled in those days. You did not talk openly about such things. You did not confront or create scandal. You just quietly accepted the situation and tried to maintain the appearance of respectability. Choti Dadi had never had any children. Whether this was by choice or due to medical reasons or simply because of the state of her marriage, I do not know. But the lack of children had left her somewhat isolated within the family structure. In traditional Indian families, A woman's status and security often come from being a mother, from having children who will care for her and advocate for her. Without children, Choti Dadi had less power and less protection within the family system. She had been more vulnerable, more dependent on the goodwill of others, more alone. Her death had been sudden and unexpected. The official story was that it had been an accident of some kind, though the details were vague and no one seemed willing to talk about exactly what had happened. There were whispers and hints that maybe it had not been entirely accidental, that maybe Choti Dadi had been so unhappy with her life and her marriage that she had taken her own life. But again, these were just whispers, just speculation. No one knew for sure, or if they did know, they were not talking about it openly. What I do know for certain is that on a particular evening, we received a phone call at our home in the city. My father answered the phone, and I watched his face change as he listened to whoever was speaking on the other end. When he hung up, he looked grim and sad. He told us that Choti Dadi had died, that we needed to pack our things immediately and travel to the village for the funeral rituals. In our culture and tradition, when someone dies, the family and community come together very quickly to perform the necessary rituals and ceremonies. The body must be prepared, prayers must be said, the cremation or burial must take place, and family members must gather to mourn and support each other. All of this happens very fast, usually within a day or two of the death. So when we got the news about Choti Dadi, we had to act immediately. My mother quickly packed bags for all of us, throwing in clothes and toiletries and anything else we might need for a few days in the village. My father made arrangements for time off from work. And within a couple of hours of receiving the phone call, we were in the car, driving through the evening toward the village where most of my father's extended family still lived. The drive took several hours. We left the city and traveled through smaller towns and then through rural areas, along roads that got progressively narrower and less well maintained. I remember watching the sun set through the car window, the sky turning orange and pink, and then gradually darkening to purple, and finally to black. By the time we arrived at the village, it was fully night, probably around 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening. The village was small, just a collection of houses and a few shops clustered along a main road, with agricultural fields stretching out in all directions beyond the inhabited area. Most of my father's relatives lived in a large family compound, a collection of connected houses that had been built over multiple generations as the family had grown and expanded. This compound was where Choti Dadi had lived, and this was where the funeral rituals were being held. When we arrived, the compound was full of people. Family members had come from all over the region, along with neighbors and friends and community members who had known Choti Dadi. There were cars and motorcycles and bicycles parked everywhere. The house was lit up brightly, with electric lights and oil lamps creating a warm glow that spilled out into the courtyard. But despite the number of people and the bright lights, the atmosphere was heavy and sad. This was a funeral, a time of mourning and grief. People spoke in low voices, if they spoke at all. Many of the women were crying, tears streaming down their faces as they sat together in groups, supporting each other in their sorrow. According to tradition, the women and men separated for much of the funeral rituals. The men gathered in one area to perform certain ceremonies and prayers, while the women gathered elsewhere to perform their own rituals and to comfort each other. When my mother and I arrived, we were directed toward the area where the women had gathered. Choti Dadi's body had already been prepared according to tradition, and was lying in state in one of the rooms of the house, surrounded by flowers and incense, while family members took turns sitting with her and saying their goodbyes. The actual cremation would take place the next day, but tonight was for grieving, for coming together as a family and community to acknowledge the loss. The scene inside the house was intense and overwhelming. There were women everywhere, sitting on the floor in groups, many of them crying and wailing in the traditional expression of grief. The sound of their crying filled the house, a collective mourning that was both heartbreaking and somewhat suffocating in its intensity. My mother and I found it difficult to stay in that environment. The grief was so thick and heavy, and the house was hot and crowded with so many people packed into a relatively small space. My mother whispered to me that we should go up to the terrace, the flat roof of the building that could be accessed by a staircase. In traditional Indian houses, especially in villages, the terrace serves as an additional living space, a place where people can go to get fresh air and escape the heat and crowding of the indoor spaces. We made our way through the crowds and up the stairs to the terrace. When we emerged onto the open roof, the contrast was immediate and striking. Instead of the hot, crowded, grief-filled atmosphere of the house below, up here there was cool night air and open space and relative quiet. We could still hear the sounds of mourning from below, but they were muffled and distant. We were not the only ones who had escaped to the terrace. My father's other aunt, who I will call Chachi, was already up there, standing near the edge of the terrace and looking down at the activities in the courtyard below. Chachi was Choti Dadi's sister-in-law, married to another of my father's uncles, and the two women had been close. Chachi's eyes were red from crying, and her face showed the strain and exhaustion of grief. My mother and I joined Chachi at the edge of the terrace, and the three of us stood together in silence for a while, looking down at the scene below. From this vantage point, we could see the entire courtyard, lit up by lights, filled with people coming and going, participating in the various rituals and ceremonies that were taking place. It was like watching a play or a movie, being able to observe everything from a distance without being caught up in it directly. We stood there for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, not talking much, just being present together in our shared grief and discomfort with the situation. And then I heard something that made me turn my head and listen more carefully. It was a sound of someone crying, not the loud, dramatic wailing that was coming from the women downstairs, but a different kind of crying. This was quieter, more subdued, almost like someone trying to cry without being heard. It was a sound of deep sadness and pain, the kind of crying that comes from the very depths of a person's soul. At first, I assumed the sound was coming from below, from one of the many women who were mourning downstairs. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that was not right. The sound was not coming from below at all. It was coming from a different direction entirely, from somewhere behind us, from the opposite side of the terrace. I turned to look in that direction, but I could not see anyone. The terrace was not completely empty. There were a few other people scattered around, sitting in small groups or standing alone. But none of them appeared to be the source of the crying sound I was hearing. The sound was clear and distinct, definitely someone crying, but I could not identify where it was coming from, or who was making it. I felt confused and a little unsettled. I turned to my mother and asked, "Did you hear something? Like someone crying?" My mother did not answer right away. She glanced at Chachi, and the two of them exchanged a look that I could not quite interpret. Then my mother said, in a casual tone that sounded forced, "It is probably just someone downstairs. The sound carries strangely at night." But that did not make sense. The crying I was hearing was not coming from downstairs. It was coming from right here on the terrace, from somewhere close by. I was sure of it. I looked at my mother more carefully, and I could see that she looked uncomfortable, maybe even a little frightened, though she was trying to hide it. "Are you sure?" I pressed. "It sounds like it is coming from up here, not from downstairs." Chachi spoke up then, her voice quiet but firm. "Do not worry about it," she said. "Sometimes sounds carry strangely when there are so many people around. It is nothing to be concerned about." But I could tell from her face and her tone that she did not really believe what she was saying. She had heard the sound too, and it had disturbed her. Both my mother and Chachi were trying to dismiss it, trying to convince themselves and me that it was nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. But I could sense their unease, could feel the tension in the air between us. Later, after we had gone back downstairs and the evening had progressed, my mother quietly told me that she and Chachi had been hearing that crying sound for at least 5 minutes before I had arrived on the terrace, and heard it too. They had been standing there, listening to this strange, sourceless crying, trying to figure out where it was coming from and what it meant. But they had not wanted to say anything, had not wanted to acknowledge it or give voice to the fear that was growing in both of them. Because deep down, though neither of them wanted to admit it, they both had the same thought. The crying they were hearing, the sad pain-filled weeping that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, sounded like it might be Choti Dadi. It sounded like the ghost of the woman we had come to mourn, crying for the life she had lived and lost, for the unhappiness that had marked her existence, for all the things that had gone wrong and could never be fixed now that she was dead. But that was impossible, of course. Ghosts do not exist, or at least that is what we tell ourselves in our rational moments. And even if ghosts did exist, why would Choti Dadi's ghost be up on the terrace, crying? Her body was downstairs, surrounded by mourners and rituals. If her spirit was going to linger anywhere, it would be there, not up here on the empty roof. So my mother and Chachi had stood there, listening to the impossible crying, trying to convince themselves that there must be some logical explanation, trying not to let their fear and superstition override their common sense. And when I had arrived and heard it too, they had done their best to dismiss it, to act like it was nothing, to protect me from the fear they were feeling. Eventually the crying sound faded away and stopped. We stayed on the terrace for a while longer, none of us willing to acknowledge what we had all heard. And then we went back downstairs to rejoin the rest of the family. The funeral rituals continued late into the night, with prayers and ceremonies and the constant sound of mourning filling the house. Finally, sometime after midnight, the initial rituals were completed and people began to settle down to rest. The family compound was too crowded for everyone to sleep indoors, so many of us were going to sleep on the terrace, which is a common practice in Indian villages, especially during warm weather. The terrace provides a cool open space where people can spread out mats or lightweight cots and sleep under the stars. My mother, my father, and I arranged our sleeping mats on the terrace, along with several other family members who were also sleeping up there. It was a clear night, and despite the sadness of the occasion, there was something peaceful about lying under the open sky, feeling the cool night breeze, listening to the sounds of the village settling down to sleep. I fell asleep fairly quickly, exhausted from the long drive and the emotional intensity of the evening. I do not know how long I had been asleep when I was awakened by a commotion. There was shouting, people moving around quickly, a sense of panic and alarm in the air. I sat up on my mat, confused and disoriented, trying to figure out what was happening. In the dim light, I could see a group of people gathered around something, or someone. As my eyes adjusted and I became more fully awake, I realized they were gathered around my mother, who was lying on the ground near the stairs that led down from the terrace. My father was kneeling beside her, his hands on her shoulders, speaking to her urgently. My mother looked pale and shocked, her eyes wide and staring, her body trembling. Other family members were gathering around, asking what had happened, trying to understand the situation. I scrambled to my feet and rushed over to where my mother was. "What happened?" I asked my father. "Is she okay?" My father looked up at me, his face tight with worry. "She fell," he said. "She went downstairs to get some water and something happened. She fell." But even as he said this, I could tell there was more to the story. People do not just fall downstairs and then lie on the ground looking like they have seen a ghost, trembling and pale, and unable to speak coherently. Something else had happened. Something that had terrified my mother so badly that she had lost her footing on the stairs and fallen. It took several minutes to calm my mother down enough that she could speak and tell us what had happened. Even then, her words came out in a disjointed rush, not making complete sense at first, and we had to piece together the story from her fragmented explanation. She had woken up feeling thirsty, she said. The night air on the terrace was dry, and her throat had been parched. She had remembered that there was drinking water downstairs in the kitchen area, so she had gotten up from her sleeping mat, being careful not to wake anyone else, and had made her way to the stairs that led down from the terrace. The terrace stairs were not well lit. There was a single bulb at the top of the stairs, but it provided only dim illumination, and the stairway itself descended into darkness. But my mother had been up and down these stairs many times over the years during various family visits, and she knew them well enough to navigate them even in poor light. She had started down the stairs, moving carefully in the darkness, one hand on the wall for balance. The house below was mostly quiet now, most people having gone to sleep, though she could hear a few quiet voices from some of the rooms where some family members were still awake, keeping vigil near Choti Dadi's body according to tradition. She had descended about halfway down the stairs when she noticed something that made her pause. There was a dark shape on the stairs below her, a shadow that was deeper and more solid than the surrounding darkness. At first, she thought it might be just a trick of the light, or perhaps some object that someone had left on the stairs. But as she looked more carefully, the shape resolved itself into something recognizable. It was a woman, sitting on the stairs. The woman was hunched over, her face down, her whole posture suggesting deep sadness or despair. She was dressed in dark-colored clothing that blended into the shadows, which was why my mother had not seen her clearly at first. My mother had assumed this was one of the household servants or helpers, someone who had been working during the funeral rituals and had gotten exhausted and sat down on the stairs for a rest. It seemed like an odd place to sit, blocking the stairs like that, but people do strange things when they are tired and grieving. So my mother had called out gently, not wanting to startle the woman, but needing to get past her to reach the kitchen. "Who is this?" she had asked in Hindi, her voice quiet so as not to disturb anyone who might be sleeping nearby. And then, from the hunched figure on the stairs came a response. A voice, quiet but clear, speaking in Hindi. The words were, "Tumbi meri baat nahi sunogi." In English, this translates roughly to "You also will not listen to me, or you will not listen to my words either." It was a strange thing to say, a phrase that suggested sadness and resignation and a history of being ignored or dismissed. My mother had been confused by this response. She had opened her mouth to ask what the woman meant, to ask who she was and why she was sitting on the stairs in the middle of the night. But before she could speak, the woman had begun to turn her head, slowly lifting her face to look up at my mother. And what my mother saw in that moment made her blood turn to ice in her veins, made her heart stop and her breath catch in her throat, made every rational thought flee from her mind, and left her with nothing but pure, primal terror. The face looking up at her from the stairs was the face of Choti Dadi, the woman whose body was lying in state downstairs, surrounded by flowers and mourners, the woman we had come to the village to bury, the woman who had died the day before, and whose funeral we were attending. Choti Dadi's face was pale and expressionless, her eyes dark and empty, staring up at my mother with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through to her soul. There was no mistaking who it was. My mother knew that face, had known it for years. This was not some stranger who happened to resemble Choti Dadi. This was Choti Dadi herself, sitting on the stairs, speaking, moving, looking at my mother as if she was still alive. But she was not alive. She was dead. Her body was downstairs in the room where the family was keeping vigil. So what was sitting on these stairs? What was looking at my mother with those empty eyes? What had spoken those sad, resigned words about not being listened to? The scream that tore from my mother's throat was involuntary, a sound of pure terror that erupted from the deepest part of her being. She stumbled backward, lost her footing on the stairs, and fell. She did not remember the actual fall or hitting the ground. Her next clear memory was of lying on the terrace with people gathered around her. My father's hands on her shoulders, voices asking if she was okay. When she tried to tell people what she had seen, many of them dismissed it. They said she had been dreaming, or that in the darkness and the stress of the occasion she had mistaken some shadow or some other person for Choti Dadi. They said that grief and exhaustion can play tricks on the mind, can make you see things that are not really there. They said she should rest, should drink some water, should try to calm down and not upset herself further. But my mother knew what she had seen. She knew the difference between a dream and reality, between a shadow and a person, between a living woman and the ghost of someone who had just died. She had seen Choti Dadi sitting on those stairs. She had heard Choti Dadi's voice speaking those words of sadness and resignation. And she had looked into Choti Dadi's eyes and seen something there that she would never be able to forget or explain away. In the days and weeks that followed, my mother tried many times to make sense of what she had experienced that night. She went over every detail, analyzing and reanalyzing, trying to find some rational explanation that would allow her to dismiss the experience as something ordinary rather than supernatural. But no rational explanation ever felt satisfactory. Yes, it had been dark on the stairs. Yes, she had been tired and emotionally drained. Yes, grief and stress can affect perception. But none of these factors could explain what she had seen and heard with such clarity and certainty. The image of Choti Dadi sitting on those stairs, the sound of her voice speaking those sad words, the look in her eyes as she turned to face my mother. These things were too clear, too specific, too real to be dismissed as tricks of the mind or shadows in the darkness. My mother began to think more deeply about those words that Choti Dadi's ghost had spoken. You also will not listen to me. What did that mean? Who else had not listened to Choti Dadi? And what had she wanted to say that no one would hear? The more my mother thought about it, the more she believed she understood. Choti Dadi had lived a difficult, unhappy life. She had been trapped in a bad marriage with an unfaithful husband. She had no children to give her comfort or status or protection. She had probably suffered in silence for years, unable to speak openly about her unhappiness because that was not how things were done in the traditional family structure. No one had listened to her complaints or her pain when she was alive. Everyone had ignored her suffering, had told her to be patient, to accept her fate, to not make trouble or create scandal. And now, even in death, she was still not being heard. The family had closed ranks around the official story of her death, whatever that was. The whispers about possible suicide were just whispers. Nothing that anyone would acknowledge openly or investigate seriously. Choti Dadi's voice, her story, her truth, was being silenced in death just as it had been silenced in life. And when my mother had encountered her ghost on the stairs, when Choti Dadi had tried one more time to speak, to say something about her experience and her pain, my mother had not listened then either. She had screamed and run away, terrified by the supernatural encounter, unable to overcome her fear long enough to hear what Choti Dadi might have wanted to say. You also will not listen to me. It was an accusation, but also a statement of resignation. Choti Dadi had known even as she spoke that her words would not be heard, that even appearing as a ghost would not be enough to make people finally pay attention to her. She had lived ignored and died ignored. and her ghost would be ignored too. This interpretation of the encounter made my mother feel terribly sad and guilty. She wished she could go back to that moment on the stairs, wished she could control her fear and actually listen to what Choti Dadi's ghost wanted to tell her. But of course, that was impossible. The moment had passed, and my mother had run away in terror instead of listening. My mother also began to connect the crying sound that we had heard on the terrace earlier that evening with the encounter on the stairs. That sourceless, mournful crying that seemed to come from nowhere, that made all of us uncomfortable, but that we had tried to dismiss and ignore. That had been Choti Dadi too, she believed. It had been Choti Dadi's ghost, crying for her wasted life, her unhappy marriage, her voiceless existence, crying to be heard and acknowledged by the family that had failed her both in life and in death. And we had ignored that crying too. We had heard it clearly, all three of us, but we had dismissed it, had pretended it was nothing, had refused to acknowledge what we were hearing because it frightened us and challenged our comfortable assumptions about reality. Even after death, Choti Dadi could not make herself heard. That was the true tragedy of her story, my mother believed. Not just that she had died, possibly by her own hand, but that even her death and her attempts to communicate after death were met with denial and dismissal. These thoughts weighed heavily on my mother for a long time. She carried guilt about her reaction on the stairs, about screaming and running instead of listening. She carried sadness about Choti Dadi's life and death. And she carried fear, the deep visceral fear that comes from having encountered something supernatural. Something that should not exist according to our modern rational understanding of the world, but that nevertheless does exist. That is real in some way we cannot fully explain or understand. The memory of that night has never faded from my mother. Even now, many years later, if you ask her about it, she can describe every detail with perfect clarity. The feeling of walking down those dark stairs, the shape of the figure sitting below her, the words that were spoken, the moment when the face turned toward her and she recognized who it was, the terror that seized her and made her scream and fall. All of it is still vivid in her memory, as clear as if it happened yesterday rather than years ago. She has told this story many times to family members and friends, and the response has always been mixed. Some people believe her completely, accepting that she really did see Choti Dadi's ghost on those stairs. Others are skeptical, suggesting various rational explanations for what she experienced. Still others listen politely but clearly think she was either dreaming or mistaken or exaggerating what was probably a much more mundane experience. But the skepticism of others has never shaken my mother's certainty about what she saw. She knows what happened that night. She knows she was fully awake and alert. She knows the difference between reality and dream, between seeing something clearly and glimpsing something ambiguous in poor light. She saw Choti Dadi's ghost, heard her voice, looked into her eyes, and that experience has changed her, has made her more open to the possibility of supernatural phenomena, has given her a permanent connection to a mystery that she will never fully solve. As for me, I cannot say for certain what my mother encountered on those stairs. I was not there. I did not see what she saw. I can only report what she has told me, and what I myself experienced that evening when I heard the strange crying sound on the terrace. But I believe my mother is telling the truth as she understands it. I do not think she is lying or making up the story. She truly believes she saw Choti Dadi's ghost, and her belief is based on what seemed to her to be a clear, unambiguous experience. Whether there are rational explanations for such experiences, whether ghosts exist in any objective sense, these are questions I cannot answer. All I can say is that my mother had an experience that night that terrified her and changed her. An experience that she interprets as having seen the ghost of a woman who died sad and unheard, and who was trying, even in death, to make someone listen to her story. And maybe that is the lesson of this story, if there is a lesson to be learned. Maybe we should listen more carefully to the people around us, especially those who seem sad or troubled or trapped in difficult situations. Maybe we should pay attention when someone tries to tell us about their pain or their unhappiness, rather than dismissing their concerns or telling them to be patient or accept their fate. Maybe if we listened better in life, there would be fewer ghosts trying desperately to be heard in death. Choti Dadi's ghost spoke words that haunt me almost as much as they haunt my mother. You also will not listen to me. How many people live and die feeling that no one truly hears them? How many voices are silenced, dismissed, ignored? And what happens to those unheard voices? Do they simply fade away, or do they linger, trying again and again to be acknowledged, to be validated, to be heard? I do not know the answers to these questions, but I know that on a night when my family gathered to mourn a woman who had lived an unhappy life, my mother encountered something on a dark staircase that she believes was that woman's ghost, still trying to speak, still trying to be heard, still crying out for acknowledgement even though she already knew that no one would listen. That is the story of the woman on the stairs. It is my mother's story, but it is also Choti Dadi's story, a story of a life unlived and a voice unheard. And it is a story that reminds us that the deepest horror is not always found in the supernatural or the unexplained, but sometimes in the very ordinary tragedy of human beings who live and die without anyone truly listening to what they have to say. My mother saw Choti Dadi on those stairs. She heard her voice. She looked into her eyes, and she ran away in terror, unable to listen, unable to hear what that ghost might have wanted to tell her. And that failure to listen, more than the supernatural encounter itself, is what haunts my mother still. Not the ghost, but the message of the ghost. Not the appearance of the dead woman, but the words she spoke about not being heard. You also will not listen to me. Those words echo through the years. A reminder of all the people we fail to hear, all the voices we ignore, all the stories we never allow to be told. And they are a warning that sometimes those silenced voices find a way to speak, even if it takes death itself to give them the courage to finally cry out and demand to be acknowledged. That is the most real horror of all. Last story. The house where she died. Some houses hold more than just memories of the people who lived there. Some houses hold something darker, something that refuses to leave, something that watches and waits and makes its presence known in ways that terrify the living. I grew up in such a house, and the experiences my family had there in the year 2000 changed all of us forever. What started as just an uncomfortable feeling, a sense that something was not quite right, eventually escalated into encounters so frightening that my parents did something they had never done before. They abandoned a home they had worked hard to afford, packed up our entire family in a rush, and fled to a new house, leaving behind furniture and belongings, because getting out was more important than taking everything with us. This is the story of why we ran, of what we encountered in that house, and of the night when we learned the terrible truth about who else was living there with us. Before I tell you about the terrifying things that happened in that house, I need to give you some background about my family and our situation at that time. It was the year 2000, right at the turn of the millennium, and I was very young, probably around 5 or 6 years old. I was the youngest in a family with several older siblings, brothers and sisters who ranged in age from early teens to late teens. My parents were hardworking people who had saved and struggled to buy a house where we could all live together, a place we could call our own rather than renting apartments or living with extended family, as we had done before. The house they found and purchased was in a neighborhood that seemed nice enough. It was not a new house. It had been built probably in the 1970s or 1980s, based on the style and the fixtures. But it was solid and spacious, with enough bedrooms for all of us kids, and a yard where we could play. The price was affordable, which was important for my parents who were stretching their budget to make home ownership possible. Looking back now, I wonder if the price was lower than it should have been, because the previous owners knew something about the house that they were not telling potential buyers. But at the time, my parents were just happy to have found a place we could afford. We moved into the house with excitement and hope. This was supposed to be a new chapter for our family, a place where we would make happy memories, where we kids would grow up and eventually leave to start our own lives. My parents had worked so hard to make this possible, and they were proud of what they had achieved. We all helped with the move, carrying boxes and furniture, claiming bedrooms, talking about how we would decorate and arrange things. It should have been a happy time, but almost from the first day, something felt wrong about that house. It was nothing I could have articulated as a young child, nothing specific that I could point to and say, this is the problem. It was just a feeling, a sense of unease that settled over me whenever I was in certain parts of the house. And I was not the only one who felt it. My siblings felt it too, though at first none of us talked about it openly. We did not want to seem foolish or babyish, complaining about bad feelings in a house that was supposed to be our dream home. The worst area of the house, the place where the bad feeling was strongest, was the hallway. The house was laid out in a way that required you to go through this particular hallway to get from the living areas to the bedrooms and bathroom. It was not a long hallway, maybe 15 or 20 feet, but there was something about it that made all of us uncomfortable. The hallway had a slight turn in it, an angle where the corridor shifted direction, and this turn created a blind spot where you could not see what was around the corner until you were almost there. During the day, when the house was full of light and noise and family activity, the hallway was merely unpleasant. You would walk through it quickly, not wanting to linger, feeling like you wanted to get to your destination as fast as possible. But at night, when the lights were dimmed and the house was quiet, that hallway became truly frightening. The shadows seemed deeper there, the air seemed colder, and there was always a feeling of being watched, of something paying close attention to you as you passed through that space. None of us liked using the bathroom at night because it meant walking through that hallway. We would hold it as long as possible, trying to avoid the journey. And when we absolutely had to go, we would run, moving as fast as we could through that space, trying not to look at the shadows, trying not to think about what might be watching us from the darkness. My older siblings later told me that they had similar feelings about the hallway from the very beginning. My oldest sister said she always felt like there was someone standing in that hallway, just around the turn where you could not see, waiting and watching. My brother said he felt cold whenever he walked through there, even on warm days, as if he was passing through a pocket of frigid air. My other sister said she sometimes heard breathing in that hallway, quiet and raspy, like someone struggling to get air into their lungs. But none of them told my parents about these experiences at first. They did not want to worry them or seem like they were being dramatic. And besides, what would they say? That the hallway felt creepy? That they had bad feelings about it? Adults do not take complaints like that seriously. They tell you it is just your imagination, that there is nothing to be afraid of, that you are being silly. So my siblings kept quiet, and so did I, and we all just tried to avoid that hallway as much as possible. The incident that I remember most clearly, the one that marked the beginning of the truly terrifying experiences in that house, happened on an afternoon that started out completely normal. It was daytime, probably early afternoon, and several of us kids were in the living room watching television together. I do not remember what we were watching, just that we were sitting together on the couch and on the floor, relaxed and comfortable, enjoying some show or movie that was on. At some point I needed to use the bathroom. I announced this to my sisters, probably because I wanted them to pause the show or at least tell me if I was going to miss anything important. One of my sisters acknowledged me with a nod or a grunt, barely looking away from the television screen. I got up from where I was sitting and headed toward the hallway that led to the bathroom. Even though it was daytime, and the house was not particularly dark, I still felt that familiar unease as I approached the hallway. I did not want to walk through there. I wanted to just teleport directly to the bathroom, without having to pass through that space. But of course, that was not possible. I had to go through the hallway whether I liked it or not. I decided to run. This was my usual strategy for dealing with the hallway. If I ran through it fast enough, maybe whatever was making me uncomfortable would not have time to notice me or bother me. So I took a deep breath and started running down the hallway toward the bathroom, my little legs moving as fast as they could. The hallway, as I mentioned, had a slight turn in it. You had to angle your path a bit to stay in the corridor. As I came around this turn, running at full speed, I glanced to my right where my older brother's bedroom was located. His door was open, which was not unusual. My brother often left his door open during the day. And that is when I saw it, standing at the edge of my brother's bed. Right there in his room in the middle of the afternoon was a dark figure. It was tall, much taller than any person in my family. It was dark, so dark that it seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a shadow that was deeper and blacker than any normal shadow should be. It had a vaguely human shape, with what might have been a head and shoulders and a body. But the details were indistinct, blurred, as if I was looking at it through foggy glass. The figure was just standing there, motionless, beside my brother's bed. Not doing anything, not moving, just standing and existing in that space where it absolutely should not have been. I was running fast, and I caught this image only for a split second as I passed the open doorway. But that split second was enough to burn the image into my brain, to make every alarm bell in my young mind start ringing at once. There was something in my brother's room, something that should not be there, something dark and tall and wrong. I stopped running. I actually skidded to a halt in the hallway, my momentum carrying me a few steps past the doorway. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My breath was coming in short, scared gasps. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I had just seen, trying to convince myself that I had been mistaken, that it was just a trick of the light or my imagination playing tricks on me. I turned around slowly and looked back at the doorway to my brother's room. I had to see if the figure was still there. I had to confirm whether what I had glimpsed was real or just my mind making up scary things. I took a couple of steps back toward the doorway, moving slowly now instead of running. I positioned myself where I could see into my brother's room. I looked at the spot beside the bed where I had seen the tall, dark figure. There was nothing there. The room was empty except for my brother's furniture and belongings. The edge of the bed where the figure had been standing was just empty space, normal room with normal afternoon light coming through the window. Nothing dark, nothing tall, nothing wrong. I stood there staring into the room for several long seconds, my child's brain trying to make sense of what I had seen and what I was seeing now. Where had the figure gone? It could not have left the room, because I would have seen it. There was only one door, and I was standing right next to it. There were windows, but they were closed. So where had it disappeared to? Or had it ever been there at all? Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my fear of the hallway had made me see things that were not real. Maybe my brain had taken some shadow or some piece of furniture and transformed it in that split second of panicked perception into a scary figure. I wanted to believe that explanation. I wanted to convince myself that I had been mistaken, that there had never been any figure in my brother's room. Because the alternative, the possibility that I really had seen something supernatural, was too frightening for my young mind to fully accept. I stood there for maybe a minute longer, just looking into the room, waiting to see if the figure would reappear. But nothing happened. The room remained empty and normal and non-threatening. Finally, I continued on to the bathroom, no longer running but walking slowly, my mind racing with thoughts and fears that I did not know how to process. I used the bathroom and then walked back to the living room where my sisters were still watching television. I sat down with them, but I could not focus on the show anymore. All I could think about was the figure I had seen, or thought I had seen in my brother's room. I wanted to tell my sisters about it, but I was afraid they would laugh at me or tell me I was being silly. So I kept quiet, sitting there with my secret fear, wondering what I had really seen in that hallway. That night, something even worse happened. I was still very young at that time, young enough that I was not sleeping in my own room yet. Instead, I slept in my parents' bedroom with them. My parents had a king-size bed, and I had a small mattress or sleeping mat on the floor beside their bed. This arrangement made me feel safe. Being near my parents, hearing their breathing, and knowing they were right there, protected me from the fears that came with nighttime and darkness. Or at least, it usually protected me. But not that night. I went to bed at my normal time, probably around 8 or 9 in the evening. My parents were still awake, doing evening tasks, getting ready for bed themselves. I lay on my mat on the floor, pulling my blanket up to my chin, looking around the room in the dim light from the hallway that filtered in through the partially open door. And that is when I noticed the closet. My parents' bedroom had a large closet, the kind with sliding doors that ran on a track. The closet was on the far wall of the room, opposite from where I was sleeping. The doors were closed, as they usually were at night. There was nothing unusual about the closet visually. It looked exactly like it always looked. But I had a feeling about it. A strong, undeniable feeling that something was inside that closet. Something was in there, behind those closed doors, in the darkness among my parents' hanging clothes and stored boxes. And whatever was in there was aware of me. It was watching me. I could not see it, could not hear it, could not point to any evidence that it existed. But I knew with absolute certainty that something was in that closet and that it was focused on me. Its attention locked onto me like a predator watching prey. I tried to tell myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a closet. Closets do not contain anything scary. They contain clothes and shoes and boxes of stored items. There was nothing in there that could hurt me. I was safe in my parents' room, with my mom and dad just a few feet away. But the feeling would not go away. It got stronger instead of weaker. I kept looking at that closet, at those closed sliding doors, and the feeling of being watched intensified. My heart started beating faster. My palms started sweating. My stomach began to churn with anxiety and fear. I tried closing my eyes, thinking that if I just went to sleep I would not have to deal with this feeling anymore. But closing my eyes made it worse. With my eyes closed, I could imagine more clearly what might be in that closet, what might be staring at me through the darkness and the closed doors. I could picture a face, or something like a face, pale and dead-looking, with empty eyes that nonetheless saw everything. I could imagine this thing, this presence, just standing there in the closet among the clothes, motionless and silent but intensely aware, watching me, waiting for something though I did not know what. My eyes snapped open again. I could not keep them closed. I had to see the closet, had to keep watch on those doors, had to be ready in case something happened. Though what could happen, or what I could do about it, I had no idea. The feeling continued to intensify. It was not just that something was watching me anymore. Now I felt like whatever was in that closet was malevolent, that it meant me harm, that it wanted to hurt me in some way. The air in the room seemed to get colder. My stomach churned more violently. I felt sick, actually physically ill. in a way that went beyond just nerves or fear. I kept staring at the closet doors, unable to look away. My young imagination filled in terrible details. I imagined the doors starting to slide open, just an inch at first, then wider, then wide enough for something to emerge from the darkness inside. I imagined a figure stepping out, tall and dark like the one I had seen in my brother's room that afternoon, but more solid now, more present, more threatening. But the doors did not open. They remained closed. The room remained as it was. Nothing changed except my feeling of being watched and my growing sense of nausea and fear. And then suddenly, without any warning, I threw up. My stomach, which had been churning and uncomfortable, suddenly emptied itself. I vomited right there on my sleeping mat, unable to hold it back or make it to the bathroom. The sound and smell immediately woke my parents. They both sat up in bed, confused and alarmed, trying to figure out what was happening. My mother turned on the lamp on her nightstand, flooding the room with light, and they both saw me sitting there on my mat covered in vomit, crying with fear and distress. My parents immediately went into caretaking mode. My mother helped me up and took me to the bathroom to get cleaned up while my father dealt with the mess on the floor and the soiled bedding. They were kind and gentle, not angry about being woken up or about the mess, just concerned about me and wanting to make sure I was okay. They asked me if I felt sick, if my stomach had been hurting, if I thought I might have eaten something bad. I wanted to tell them the truth, that I had thrown up because I was so scared of whatever was in the closet, that something in there had been watching me and making me feel sick with fear. But I did not know how to explain this to them in a way that would make sense. How do you tell your parents that the closet is haunted? That something evil lives in there among their clothes? They would think I had a nightmare or too much imagination. So I just said my stomach had hurt, which was true even if it was not the complete truth. My mother cleaned me up, gave me some water to drink, helped me into fresh pajamas. My father finished cleaning the floor and brought me a new blanket. They settled me back down, this time positioning my mat a little closer to their bed and a little farther from the closet, though they did not know why I might prefer that location. But even with the light on and my parents awake and aware, I still felt that presence in the closet. It was still there, still watching, still paying attention to me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The light did not banish it. My parents' presence did not protect me from it. Whatever was in that closet was not afraid of light or people. It was just there, permanent and patient, biding its time. I did not sleep well that night. I kept waking up, kept checking to make sure the closet doors were still closed, kept feeling like I was being watched. My parents slept peacefully, unaware of what I was experiencing, unaware that something was sharing their bedroom with us. The next few days were tense. I was constantly on edge, jumping at shadows, afraid to go into certain rooms of the house. My siblings noticed that I was acting strange, but they were dealing with their own experiences in the house. My oldest sister later told me that during this same time period, she had been waking up at exactly 3 a.m. every night, feeling like someone was standing beside her bed watching her sleep. My brother said he had seen the same dark figure I had seen. Multiple times, always in the hallway or standing in doorways, appearing for just a moment before disappearing. We were all being affected by whatever was in that house, but we still were not talking to each other about it, and we definitely were not telling our parents. We did not want to worry them or seem foolish. And besides, what could our parents do even if we told them? It was not like they could fight a ghost or make a haunting stop just by being parents. But then my mother had her own experience, one so frightening that she could not stay quiet about it anymore. It happened in the garage. My mother had gone out to the garage to get something, probably some item she had stored there or some tool or household supply. She was alone, My father was at work, and we kids were at school or in other parts of the house. She went into the garage through the door that connected it to the house. She turned on the light, which was a single bulb hanging from the ceiling that did not provide great illumination, but was enough to see by. She walked into the garage, looking for whatever item she needed. And then, she heard it. Breathing. Loud, raspy, labored breathing, the sound of someone or something struggling to pull air into their lungs. It was coming from somewhere in the garage, from back in the darker corners where the light from the single bulb did not reach very well. My mother froze, her heart jumping into her throat. "Hello?" She called out, thinking maybe one of us kids had followed her out here and was playing a prank or something. "Who is there?" There was no answer. Just that breathing, continuing on, in and out, harsh and difficult. My mother took a few steps toward where the sound was coming from, peering into the shadows, trying to see who or what was making that noise. "Is someone there?" She called again, her voice less steady now, beginning to shake with fear. The breathing got louder, more labored, more desperate sounding. It sounded like someone dying. Someone in the last moments of life, fighting for every breath. And then my mother saw something. In the darkest corner of the garage, where old boxes and stored items were piled up, there was a shape. A dark mass that was darker than the surrounding shadows. And this shape seemed to move slightly, seemed to be rising and falling in rhythm with the breathing sounds. That was enough for my mother. She did not wait to see more or investigate further. She turned and ran out of the garage, slamming the door behind her, her heart pounding and her hands shaking. She stood in the hallway of the house, catching her own breath, trying to calm down, trying to convince herself that what she had experienced had some rational explanation. But she could not convince herself. She knew what she had heard and seen. There had been something in that garage, something that breathed like a dying person, something that had taken physical form in the shadows, something that should not exist, but clearly did exist in that house. When my father came home from work that evening, my mother told him what had happened. She expected him to dismiss her concerns, to tell her she had been imagining things or that there was some simple explanation. But my father did not dismiss her. He listened seriously, and then he told her something he had not mentioned before. He too had been having strange experiences in the house. He had been hearing footsteps in the hallway at night when everyone was supposed to be asleep. He had been feeling cold spots in certain rooms. He had been having terrible nightmares about someone standing beside the bed watching him sleep. They compared notes and realized that the entire family was being affected by something in this house. It was not just one person having bad dreams or imagination. It was all of us, independently, experiencing frightening phenomena that we could not explain. My parents made a decision. They were going to call for help. In our culture, when you have a problem that seems supernatural or spiritual in nature, you call a shaman. Someone who has knowledge of the spirit world and the ability to deal with entities that exist beyond the physical plane. My parents contacted a shaman they knew of through community connections, explained the situation briefly, and asked him to come to the house to perform a cleansing ceremony. The shaman arrived the next day. He was an elderly man, quiet and dignified, carrying a bag with various items he would need for the ceremony. My parents welcomed him and explained in more detail what had been happening. The shaman listened carefully, asking occasional questions, his face serious and concerned. Then he walked through the house, going from room to room, spending time in each space, seeming to sense or feel or see things that we could not perceive. He paid particular attention to the hallway, standing there for several minutes, his eyes closed, his lips moving slightly as if he was speaking to something we could not see or hear. He also spent a long time in my parents' bedroom, standing in front of the closet with the sliding doors. He opened the doors and looked inside, not just at the clothes and boxes, but deeper, as if he was seeing something beyond the physical objects stored there. Finally, he gathered all of us in the living room and began the cleansing ceremony. He lit incense and candles. He chanted prayers in a language I did not understand. He used various objects from his bag, including what looked like bundles of herbs and small bells, and other items whose purposes I did not know. The ceremony went on for quite a while, maybe an hour or more, with all of us sitting quietly and watching, hoping that whatever he was doing would work, would cleanse the house and make us safe again. When the ceremony was finished, the shaman sat down with my parents to talk. He looked tired, as if the work he had done had drained him. My siblings and I were supposed to go play in another room and leave the adults to talk privately. But I was too curious. I crept close enough to the living room that I could hear what the shaman was saying to my parents. His words made my blood run cold. "This place is not safe for you and your family," the shaman said, his voice grave and serious. "There is a spirit here, a very strong presence that does not want you in this house. It is the spirit of an elderly woman who died here. She believes this is still her home, and she does not accept that other people now live here." I heard my mother gasp. My father asked the shaman if there was anything that could be done, any way to convince the spirit to leave or to make peace with it. The shaman was quiet for a moment before responding. "The spirit is very attached to this place," he said. "She died here, in this house. She died in the closet in your bedroom." When I heard those words, "She died in the closet," my entire body went rigid with terror. The closet where I had felt something watching me. The closet that had made me so scared I threw up. There was a dead woman in that closet. Not just her ghost or her spirit, but the actual location where she had taken her last breaths, where her life had ended, where her spirit had become trapped between this world and whatever comes next. I could not help myself. I started crying, right there in the hallway where I was eavesdropping. My sobs were loud enough that the adults in the living room heard me. My mother came out and found me, picked me up, tried to comfort me. But I could not be comforted. I had slept in the same room as that closet. I had felt the dead woman watching me from inside it. I had been right there, just a few feet away from where someone had died, where their spirit still lingered. My parents, seeing how terrified I was, and realizing that I had heard what the shaman said, decided not to hide the truth from the rest of my siblings either. They called all of us together and explained the situation. They told us what the shaman had said, that the house was haunted by the spirit of an elderly woman who had died here and who did not want us living in her home. They also told us that they had made a decision. We were leaving. We were going to find a new house and move out of this one as quickly as possible. They were not going to risk our safety and well-being by staying in a place that was clearly dangerous for us. That night, nobody in our family slept. We were all too scared, too aware now of what was in the house with us. We kept lights on in every room. We stayed together, not wanting anyone to be alone. Every sound, every creak of the house settling, every rustle of wind outside made us jump and look around fearfully. I kept thinking about that closet, about the woman who had died in there. How had she died? Had it been natural causes? Just an elderly woman whose heart had stopped beating? Or had it been something worse? Something tragic or violent? Had she been sick, suffering, gasping for air the way my mother had heard breathing sounds in the garage? Had she been calling for help that never came? And why was she still here? Why had her spirit not moved on to whatever afterlife awaited her? Was she trapped here somehow, unable to leave? Or did she choose to stay, clinging to her home even in death, refusing to accept that she no longer had a physical body, that other people now had a right to live in this space. I thought about all the times I had felt watched in that house, all the uncomfortable feelings in the hallway, the dark figure by my brother's bed, the presence in the closet. All of that had been her. The dead woman. She had been observing us, following us around her house, watching us with anger or resentment or perhaps just confusion about who we were and why we were in her space. The thought was terrifying but also somehow sad. She had been a person once. She had lived in this house, probably for many years. This had been her home, filled with her belongings and her memories. And then she had died, and her connection to the house had not been broken by death, but had somehow been strengthened by it, trapping her here in spirit form while strangers moved into her space and lived their lives in what she still considered to be her home. But understanding and sympathy could not overcome my fear. I did not want to stay in that house for even one more night. None of us did. We all wanted to leave immediately, to pack up and run away from this haunted place and never come back. But moving takes time, even when you are in a hurry. My parents had to find a new house, had to arrange financing, had to actually complete the purchase process. This took at least another day, possibly two. I do not remember exactly, but I know we had to spend at least one more night in that haunted house before we could leave. That second night was even worse than the first night had been. Now we knew the truth. Now we knew that there really was a ghost, that our fears had been justified, that the uncomfortable feelings and frightening experiences had not been imagination, but had been encounters with an actual spirit. And knowing made everything more intense, more frightening. We tried to sleep, but could not. Every sound was amplified. Every shadow seemed to move. We kept seeing things in our peripheral vision, shapes and movements that disappeared when we turned to look directly at them. The house felt colder, darker, more oppressive. The air itself seemed heavy, as if the presence of the dead woman had become stronger now that we knew about her, as if our awareness of her somehow gave her more power. I stayed with my parents again, refusing to be separated from them. But even with them right there, even with multiple lights on, I felt terrified. I could not stop looking at that closet, at those sliding doors that hid the space where the woman had died. I kept expecting the doors to open, kept expecting to see her ghost step out into the room, kept expecting her to finally reveal herself to us fully instead of just making her presence felt through shadows and sounds and feelings. But morning came eventually, as morning always does. The night ended without anything dramatically terrible happening. The woman's ghost did not attack us or harm us physically. She just continued to exist in the house, making her presence known, making us feel unwelcome and unsafe. And then finally, my parents completed the arrangements for a new house. It happened faster than normal home purchases usually happen. Probably because my parents were so desperate to get us out of the haunted house that they accepted whatever terms and conditions were offered without much negotiation. They just wanted a new place where we could live, anywhere that was not the house where the dead woman's spirit resided. The day we moved out of that house was one of the best days of my life. I remember the feeling of relief and joy as we loaded our belongings into trucks and cars, as we carried boxes and furniture out of that cursed place, as we drove away from it for the last time. With each mile of distance between us and that house, I felt lighter, safer, more able to breathe freely. We left some furniture and belongings behind because we were in such a hurry to get out and did not have room for everything in the vehicles we had arranged. My parents did not care. Material possessions could be replaced. What mattered was getting their children away from a place that threatened our safety and peace of mind. The new house felt completely different from the haunted one. It felt normal, neutral, safe. There were no cold spots, no creepy hallways, no feelings of being watched. It was just a house, a normal building where normal people lived normal lives. We could walk through any room at any time without feeling afraid. We could sleep peacefully without worrying about ghosts or spirits or presences in closets. It took some time for all of us to fully recover from the experience of living in the haunted house. For months afterward, I would have nightmares about the dark figure in the hallway and the presence in the closet. My siblings had their own struggles with fear and anxiety that lingered even after we had moved away from the source of our terror. But gradually, we healed. The memories became less vivid, less immediately frightening. We could talk about what had happened without being overwhelmed by fear. The haunted house became a story we told, something that had happened to us, but that was now safely in the past. Looking back now, many years later, I still do not fully understand what we experienced in that house. I do not know if the shaman was correct about the elderly woman who died in the closet, or if there was some other explanation for the phenomena we all experienced. I do not know if ghosts are real in any objective sense, or if what we encountered was something else. Some psychological or environmental factor that created shared experiences of fear and perceived supernatural occurrences. But I know what I experienced. I know what I saw and felt and sensed in that house. And more importantly, I know that it was not just me. My entire family, including my parents who were rational adults, experienced things in that house that frightened them and that they could not explain through normal means. We all felt it. We all saw things. We all knew that something was terribly wrong with that place. And when a shaman who had never been to our house before walked through it and identified the exact location where we had felt the strongest presence, when he told us about a woman who had died in the closet without any of us having mentioned the closet to him, that felt like confirmation that what we had experienced was real, that there really was something supernatural in that house. Whether the woman's spirit is still in that house, I do not know. I have never gone back to see or check. Other families have probably lived there since we moved out in 2000. I sometimes wonder if they have had similar experiences. If they too have felt watched and uncomfortable. If they too have seen dark figures and heard strange sounds. Or maybe the spirit moved on after we left. Maybe our departure satisfied her somehow, removed the intrusion of strangers from her space, and allowed her to rest. I hope she found peace, that elderly woman who died in that closet. I hope her spirit is no longer trapped in that house, no longer condemned to exist in a state between life and death, watching successive families move in and out of the space she still considers her home. Death should not be the beginning of an eternal haunting. It should be a transition to whatever comes next. Whatever rest or renewal or new existence awaits us. But whether she found peace or not, I am grateful that my family escaped that house when we did. We could have tried to stay, tried to live with the haunting, tried to ignore or accommodate the presence of the dead woman. But my parents made the brave and difficult decision to leave, to start over somewhere else, to prioritize our safety and well-being over the financial investment they had made in that house. That decision saved us, I believe. Not necessarily from physical harm, though who knows what might have happened if we had stayed longer, but from psychological and emotional damage that could have been permanent. Living in constant fear, never feeling safe in your own home, always being watched by something you cannot see or understand. That is not a way for children to grow up. That is not a way for anyone to live. So we left. We ran from that house and never looked back. And I have never regretted that decision, not for a single moment. The house where she died, where her spirit remained trapped and angry, that place is part of my past, but it does not control my present or my future. We survived it, we escaped it, and we are all stronger for having lived through it and come out the other side. That is the story of the house where I grew up, briefly in the year 2000. The house that was haunted by the spirit of an elderly woman who died in a closet and who never left. The house that terrified my entire family, until we finally had no choice but to abandon it and flee to somewhere safer. It was real. It happened. And I will never forget it.